Gonna be a long day today. We got show tonight. I still gotta practice some parts. We shall see. We shall see. I don't know if I'm riding today. I might not have time. Yeah, keep going out to those cocoa head jumps. All right, here we go. All right, so this is a video that Adam Steele did for us. If you're a Reaper user, you might know who this guy is. Or actually, it's kind of one of the more popular recording channels. But I really like how he does stuff, so this was a really good choice. He's been on Glenn's show a couple times, I think. And he's doing a video called I Can Mix Drums with No Samples Now. How to use multiband gate from AIXDSP. And this seems to be a combination of scripted and live stuff. And let's just take a look. And anybody got any questions? I think even if you've been using this product for a while, you might see some things that you might not have known. And let me know. And as we're going through this, if there's something you don't understand, we'll take a look.
Adam Steele here, and today's video is sponsored by AIXDSP. I've been moving into the whole Dolby Atmos thing recently. It's slow going, but we're getting there. But one thing that this has really highlighted is issues with certain tracks. And one of the songs that I'm going to be upmixing to Atmos has all...
You know, right here, I don't know if I can do that poll thing. I don't think I can from Restream, but how many of you guys think Atmos is really going to take off? I've seen just crazy knockdown, drag-out arguments on forums that even led to some forum locking and banning, and even one safe space mod basically doing the my girlfriend's from Canada, you wouldn't know her. So how do you guys think Atmos is going to take off? Or will it?
The drums by the wonderful Mike Mallion, who is one of my favourite drummers and a good friend. And we recorded everything with the most luxurious microphones we could find. And there's loads and loads of spill. So today we're going to do a deep dive on how to cut out all the spill noise on snares, toms, kicks properly.
Okay. So here's another controversy for you guys to talk about. There's this whole attitude by people who don't record metal, or old people, or people who either have never recorded an amateur band or have completely forgotten the days when they recorded amateur bands, or they've never actually recorded drums in their life and they're just parroting junk they hear on forums, that bleed is your friend. Embrace the bleed. You know, there's times where the extra bleed coming in from certain tracks can help and stuff, but if you really think about the way drums are mic'd and toms are panned and cymbals are panned and stuff, it really doesn't hold argument in the sound stage unless you want to make severe compromises about your levels of other things. So that one always cracks me up, and I know it can work for like jazzy jazz stuff and really mellow stuff. And somebody brought up, you know, easily those epic early Led Zeppelin sounds could have been done with with everything bleeding, probably, because mostly that sound is crushed overheads, right? But I tell you, if you know, when you're talking about like technical metal and stuff, there's not necessarily any place for bleed, and I don't think anybody really wants to hear their soundstage, their panning and everything, get completely thrown off by that bleed. So that whole embrace the bleed thing, you know, whatever. It's almost a deepity, and I guess it could really be in certain types of music, whatever. But for a lot of things, it doesn't work. And when you're talking about amateur bands who have no control over how hard or soft they're going to hit the toms compared to the cymbals, that kind of bleed doesn't help anybody. So it's usually a deepity, like I said, I think. But let me know what you guys think. And so let me keep going here.
And not just kind of try and get by with some of the older solutions. Properly, the spill noise on snares, toms, kicks. Properly, and not just kind of try and get by with some of the older solutions. Like I said, this video is sponsored by AIXDSP. This isn't a review, this is me showing you how to really get the most out of their multi-band drum gate. They have other plugins which I might use as
not just a drum gate, but that's okay.
Well, like the drum EQ.
In fact, if you guys are used to that precision gate or whatever, I think I did a video on this not too long ago. It's a basically it leaves the lows alone, I think, and just kind of gates out the highs. You can use this for that as well, and it works really good for guitar.
Which kind of focuses on notes and harmonics, which is really clever. But the multi-band gate is a great option in a situation like this. When I'm going to be up mixing this to Atmos, this video is going to be in stereo, but as I pan things around, you're really going to hear things like spill on separate microphones that much more as all the elements of a thick, busy mix start to be moved out of that stereo image and the kind of the masking of the frequencies where you get away with murder a lot of the time in a stereo mix. Suddenly a lot of that is going to be really apparent, so the gating needs to be clean.
That's terrifying to think about, like, because we do mask a lot of stuff with, you know, only coming out of two speakers or two channels. But if you can actually separate it the way Atmos lets you, boy, those things might just totally stick out. That little spit noise as the cymbals breaking into your tom sound. Ouch.
Previously, I was using all the kind of the best, you know, gates, like the Slate Trigger has a pretty good gate. The old Sonox Oxford drum gate, that was one that I used. That did a pretty good job too. But none of them
Reaper's own Re-8, thank you very much,
really did an all-encompassing thing, and sacrifices had to be made. We recorded all the toms.
So one of these sacrifices that you guys probably know, if you shut the tom off in order to keep the cymbals out of it, you're going to end up with this really short tom sound, which kind of got popular where it's just a hit of a tom with reverb on it, you know, so doom, 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 doom. And then combined with the overheads, maybe it was okay. With the more modern style of really high passing the overheads pretty hard, that won't necessarily work. Or the other compromise you could make is to let it ring out long enough, but then you end up with all kinds of cymbals in your toms. And when you go to compress it, you end up with just an auxiliary cymbal mic, probably panned wrong for where the cymbals are anyway.
With AKG 414s, which are a ridiculous mic to use on toms. They sounded fantastic, but they really let loads of spill in, especially on the 8-inch tom, which projected a certain sound, but then there was loads of spill. And on the snare as well, we were using Neumann vocal microphones, the KMS, I think it was the 104s on the top and the bottom, which again sounded great, but were not really designed for this kind of application and had an absolute ton of spill.
So if you're not used to it, like a cardioid condenser mic is basically an antenna for every unwanted sound of the whole drum set. So if it's way above the drum set, it's good at getting a whole picture of everything. You know, those classic spaced overheads or coincident pair overheads, or, you know, even for cymbal mics, hi-hat and ride, you know, you're probably going to high pass them pretty hard. They're great at picking up all that highs, but up close, anywhere near a snare and a hi-hat, you're pretty much, it's a hi-hat mic.
Which I really had to fight with to get everything right in the mix. And so I'm going to revisit that mix and try and sharpen it up with these multi-band gates as best I can before we go on in the future to then up mix this to Atmos. So without further ado, let's go to Studio B, the mix room, and really dive in with the multi-band drum gate. All right, so I'm going to
Again, it's not just a multi-band drum gate, it's a multi-band gate. Small pedantics.
to do two different things with this video. Firstly, I'm going to talk really in depth about what all the controls do in the multi-band gate and how they're relevant to you using this. Firstly as a drum gate, but I will mention also using it on other sources like guitars, vocals, and how certain settings can be relevant to you there. And then I'm going to go through a particular track that I've been working on. I have produced this track before, wasn't particularly happy with the gates that I had on the kick and the snare and the toms, and I'm remixing that song in Dolby Atmos anyway, so I really want each individual source to be as perfect as it can be. So at the second half of this video, we're going to do a practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's look at this screen. This is Reaper, of course, and I'm going to open up a copy of the multi-band gate. I already have one here, which I was using specifically on a snare channel that already had been compressed live at the studio. So this has all the settings in, but I think what I'm going to do is bring up a whole new copy of multi-band gate that is completely default. So this is my snare group that I have this on, and I'm firstly just going to loop a little section in Reaper so that we can hit play. And this is the multi-band gate currently doing a whole lot of nothing. At least I would if I had the threshold at minus infinity. Let's listen to that. That's a pretty good sounding snare track. There's quite a lot of isolation in between the different microphones. I'm going to turn off all those reverb sends. This is what we have. It's going through.
And again, this is when you have a problem with, or not a problem, where a professional drummer can really regulate how hard they hit the snare versus the hi-hat or cymbal versus tom, and can probably tolerate more distance between the cymbals and toms and the hi-hat and the snare.
Through the gate, then a compressor, then there is an EQ on the bus. So I like to use a gate before any compression or anything else. So what I'm going to do is have this multi-band gate right here at the start of the chain. And it sounds like this with no reverb. So there's a little bit of ring on the snare. There's a lot of kick going on. And well, here's a good example where there's loads of cymbal bleed.
So listen to those cymbals. Just imagine you have a compressor followed by an exciter. What is that? That is now a booster for your cymbal mics, right? It's and probably not in the way you want.
And I can tell you, if I unsolo this, you'll hear a lot of snare bleed problems in the mix. It's
And let's say your snare is pan center. Now all of a sudden your cymbals that were off to the side are now in the center. But bleed is your friend. Totally.
Most relevant when the hi-hat's really going, because it doesn't sound like it's on the left, it sounds like it's in the center because it's coming through this snare
He said the same
microphone,
thing. Thank
and
you.
that's not
mind.
acceptable.
I'm
So
redundant.
let's go through some of the settings from the beginning. The first thing that I would want to do before I even bring in the gate is I would want to flick the lever for key listen, because that then shows and we hear the what the frequencies are that this gate is looking for. So let's narrow that down to that hit.
So again, the key listen only affects what's going to the detector. So ideally you would want that to be the primary harmonic or something about that drum that's way more apparent from that drum versus anything that might be bleeding into it. Obviously you think, oh, the fundamental harmonic. But of course that doesn't always work that well because the way the energy works is kind of like a slow buildup. So it might not be percussive enough that way. But that's why we have this transient shaper in here that, thanks to Jason Zadora for recommending it. That'll allow you to kind of pump up the low-end transients if you have to do a low harmonic. The other thing that helps with that, and you know, I love to have zero latency plugins because that way I can mix as I'm recording. But something else that'll help with that problem is a lot of look ahead. And there's a look ahead control on the far left here. So it's one way of doing it.
Now, these slopes are definable where it says high pass and low pass slope. I can change those just by clicking and dragging to be less or more effective. But I do tend to find that this is absolutely fine as is. There is also a transient shaper if needed, so you can use a transient shaper on your source, which I'm going to add some attack here.
And again, this is just for the detector. This does not put a transient shaper on your drum itself.
Here. And remove some of the sustain from, not from the signal, but from what we're using to gate. So
if you look at the bottom here in the threshold window, you'll notice that as the sustain came down, the attack went up. The shape of this thing changed drastically. It's much more obvious where the drum is and how long it lasts.
There we go. I'm adding a little bit more mid-range back to that because the hit on the transient is all up there.
And again, the transient shaper is most effective at the higher levels, the higher frequencies. It's not as effective on the lower frequencies. We're working on that. So hopefully that's something that's going to change pretty soon too.
That's a very clean signal to start with. So we untick the key listen. It's worth noting that the transient shaper option only appears when you're in key listen mode. So sonically, that will have done nothing. What I want to do now is bring in the gate threshold. Now, when we're looking at the gate threshold here, I'm going to bring that up a little bit. Because what I've decided I'm going to do with all the ghost notes is separately, I'm going to have a separate copy of the undersnare wires. It's a trick that I do a lot, which can be heavily compressed and sit underneath the mix for that ticky, 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 ticky. What I'm trying to gate here is the big hits of the snare without overly removing everything else. Now, all the settings for the low, mid, and high are all pretty much preset here, and they all need tweaking. But before they do, let's look at another couple of features. We can change the gate source. We've used the audio, but if I click that, you can use a MIDI trigger if you already have something like a sort of a MIDI triggering system. Let's say that you had a clamp MIDI trigger on a drum, on a real drum. You could take that MIDI information and send that into this multiband gate here, and very cleanly get every hit from that clean pizzo pickups MIDI notes. And that's a really good way of using triggers that isn't triggering the sound. So you would then define the MIDI channel, and it has MIDI notes all here, but usually like for a snare, I think that would be 38, I believe. The second, the D1, so usually C1 is the kick and D1's the snare. But whatever note you want to bring in from your MIDI, you can define that. And if you click that gate source again, you get both. So you can trigger it both from audio and from MIDI. So you can have a really clean hybrid of the two. Going back to the audio.
Okay, so hopefully, I don't think he gets into this, but I need you guys to know this one. The one of the really good uses of doing the both is that you can, let's say you're going to hear him. Actually, I think you already heard. There's some ghost notes and stuff. If you really want the gate to open and your threshold is too high for a stray hit here or there, just add a MIDI note right there on your and feed it into that track. Either use Reaper sidechain to do it, or routing to do it, or you could even let's say I'm not going to bring up a mix unless I have to, but I'm gonna pull up Reaper real quick. Let's say you had this is your snare track, and you also so insert a MIDI item. You could actually have a macro for this, but let's just edit this little thing right here. Open item in editor, and let's say we're doing snare and we want a 38. So I'm just going to put a note right here. Probably put it in diamond mode. There we go. And so what I would do, you could do this inside the MIDI editor. I don't usually do it. I would do a probably a tab to transient. Cinch this right up to the edge. You know how to do this. So basically you drop this with the tab to transient or whatever. And let's say you had a snare that didn't want to open, and it was right here or something. You just drop that guy down right there. You could either do it by hand or, like I say, tab to transient. If you want to make it real easy, just drag that track underneath the other track. Actually turns the snare track into a folder track, but it would just be your MIDI information here, so you could drop them wherever you want. Open up that gate.
Source. For drums, I would probably just want a straight threshold. But if it was something like, let's say, a guitar solo where there's a big and then some stuff that's not quite so loud afterwards, you could use hysteresis, and hysteresis usually goes underneath your threshold. So your threshold is where the gate opens, and then the hysteresis or hysteresis, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, I
think it's hysteresis, but basically that's your gate's closing threshold. That might be different than your opening threshold. Just like he said, guitar solos are a perfect example where this note's like trailing out, but you don't want it to die. You wouldn't want a quiet note opening the gate, but you don't want it closing until it's well below the closing threshold.
Where the gate closes again. So it gives kind of some wiggle.
It actually can work especially for toms. But it seems the most obvious. Most people know it from guitar stuff.
Whereas with a drum, we very usually want a very clean open and close on a bang kind of threshold thing. Now, we're going to be moving upwards on the plugin from the bottom. So next, we're going to look at the low, mid, and high bands. Now, I'm going to focus on one of these bands. Let's say the mid band, because all these controls are copied 3 times over for your lows, your mids, and your highs. and how you want to treat them is entirely up to you, but I'm going to talk about how it would be used on a drum. So the buttons, let's look at the buttons because these are really useful. Each one, so we're looking at the green one, has attack, hold and release knobs, but then it has bypass, which means that the gate is no longer gating. Solo, so we're only hearing this band, which is useful for when we're dialing it in. Mute, which entirely just kills the signal for that band. And then a phase flip, so a polarity flip.
You see how he had to catch himself there because all the pedants that were going to get in there. It's not a phase switch, man. It's a polarity switch. Okay. We know what it means. If we're allowed to redefine terms all the time, by now it's a phase switch. Sorry.
If it turns out that we want to completely change the polarity of one for some special effect or something, then we can do that, and that will change just that band. Now, let's hit that S. That's why I wanted to talk about those first, because now on loop, I can just solo the mids. Now, the attack is how quickly the gate opens. I tend to find that I want a very, very quick attack on something like a snare. Although very rare that I want 0. Seems to be okay here, but often, especially on the low one, I find that really, really fast attacks end up sounding very clicky. And then we have hold and release. Next.
Okay, it's probably going to go through this later on, but I'll just say it. So you notice that the attacks are defaulted to 1. That's usually enough to get it from actually making that digital click. Sometimes you want it because it actually adds a little bit of transient and percussion to it. I found on the highest sometimes, but if you want to make sure that the signal is open during the transient of your drum, just set the look ahead longer. I know that sucks for live use, but if you're talking about in a mixing situation, turn up the look ahead. And with the early experiments with the regate, we found that sometimes you had to have drastically long look aheads to keep the low end all in there. And I mean like 20 to 30, 40 milliseconds, like crazy stuff. So experiment with that. And that way you can get all the drum through there without that clicking noise that you don't want.
Next time I hit play, look at the green on the bit above, and you'll see a bit where the gate stays open all the way. That's the hold, and then you'll see it drop off, and that's the release. So if I had very, very short or no release, it will go.
Oh, I guess I should say it now. We're going to be adding more shapes to the release. Right now, it's kind of what Reaper would consider the slow fade out, and I want to have some more shapes for that. Now, I'm not sure if it's going to be continuously variable. Some of you guys had an alpha where it actually was a continuously variable shape, or if we're just going to do like 3, maybe slow, linear, and fast. So we'll see about that.
Conversely, if I have no hold and plenty of release, it will start fading immediately as the drums hit.
So you see that shape right there, right? We're going to have more shapes.
So what I probably want to find is a middle ground between the hold with the durng of the kind of the note of the drum and a relatively short release that doesn't sound choked. There we go. And just above that, there is the floor, which is a bar that we can drag around. And what that will do is that can introduce a little bit of the ungated signal up to where you want it. So what that does is that gives you kind of some of the bleed in that area, which I probably would do.
Yeah, see, so as much as I laugh at the embrace the bleed people, if they really want it, it's there. So there's a amount control here. just like maybe the range you would have on a regular gator expander or ratio. But in this case, it's kind of like a mix, a wet-dry mix per band. And I don't know if he said it, but up here you actually can change where the crossover is, and that's going to make a big difference. He has his mid crossover set pretty high for the application, how I would think he'd be using it. But he has his own style. So
Do in the mid range. Because that way it sounds a lot more like a natural ungated signal, but a lot like it, but not exactly it. Now, that means that on that kind of mid-range, it can sound really kind of real, if you know what I mean, that it sounds not gated. Whereas we're going to get a little bit more extreme with the low and the mid for what I would like to do.
the low and the high.
And we're going to move all the way up to the top because here we've got the 3 bands. And what I can do is I can move around what each band is. So kind of where those crossover points are. And so I'm going to move the low and the high around for the mids and define where the mids are. And what I'm trying to find here for me on the snare is kind of the low range. I'm looking to go just to where I can feel the natural kind of beat of the snare without bringing too much super low end in, because I'm going to quite tightly gate the low end to give me that doof, doof, doof kind of thing on the bottom of the snare without bringing any rumble in. But also on the top end, I'm trying to find where the cymbals really begin and make sure that's not in there. But most of that naturalness is. Let's find. There. That's about right for me. And the kind of the controls that I went across there, the look ahead, I like to have a little bit of look ahead on a snare gate, especially because then any attack values, it's got a warning of how that is going to be approached, so that the gate is already open before the crack of that hit comes in, so you don't get as many of those clicky artifacts. We've got pre-gate spectrum. So the pre-gate spectrum shows the audio spectrum up here, completely unfiltered. Side chain, I'll come back to because that could be really powerful. Key listen, we already did. And then the crossovers can be changed between 6 dB crossovers, which are far more gentle.
Hey,
but the whole thing about phase, if you're worried about phase, is less of a problem. But you do get much more bleed in between your crossover points. So the mid-range, which was still soloing, now sounds like this on 6 dB crossovers. So there's much more bleed either way, whereas 24 dB, it's really far more specific at the possible risk of phase shift, which may...
Yeah, and it depends how you're using this too, because so many of us, I know, but so many of us barely have anything in that mid band, and at that point, the high and the low part of the snare phase kind of becomes irrelevant to each other. It's still an issue with, let's say, your overheads or whatever, but again, the kind of styles of music we're talking about, chances are you're high passing the overhead so much that the low end phase probably isn't going to matter that much in the snare. Or you could just throw on the 6 dB crossovers, and it's still going to be way the hell better than it was before, but it will have more, not as much potential to reject the bleed as you had maybe.
May not be a problem, depending on how many elements of bleed you have in other microphones. That may not be a problem for you depending on your sources. And then lastly, the red, green, blue bars can be grabbed to change the overall volume of a specific band.
Now, this is one of my quality of life features, I think, my ergonomics, or you could just say because I'm lazy as hell. a lot of times that's, I know. A lot of times that's a lot of the EQ I do right there is just grab that band and turn it up or down.
That can be a really good secret weapon if you've got kind of the gating is right. And now you want to balance the amount of low end, mid, and high end without having to bring an EQ into the mix. It can be a real kind of clever, like I say, secret weapon there. So now that we've done the mid band, I'm now going to solo the high band and really get a tick, 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 a much more
Okay, and as cool as this is, and I love my product, you're going to hear probably when you do the highs why it is that we're adding shapes, because it's just going to make it so much easier to get exactly what you want. I mean, it's in context, it always all works out, but when I'm listening to it in solo, I'm like, you know, if it just had some more shapes for the fades, I could get this a little bit happier for me.
aggressive snap on this.
And this, man, I'm sorry to keep interrupting, but if you're wondering why isn't there a per band threshold, we're working on a multi-band compressor. We actually have a build of it, but if we do dynamic EQ, that's more the range of dynamic EQ and multi-band compressor, because unlike much of the competition, like the dynamics we have in dynamic EQ have either compressor, like you expect, a downward expander or an upward expander. Seems like lots of times when they have expanders, it's only either the downward one or the upward one. We got both here. And so if you really want a per band threshold, say if you like knocked out some of these, you could do it just in dynamic EQ. And there's a possibility we might add some per band threshold stuff, independent threshold in multi-band gate. I'm not sure if that's going to make it harder to use, but we'll look into it. But right now, if you really want a per band threshold, you're probably better off in dynamic EQ. Okay, so let me get out of there. Get back to...
There we go. Now that sounds really aggressive with that.
Yeah, but you know, again, you got to put it in context, because that really aggressive little spit right there might be exactly what the doctor ordered.
Now let's try it in context with the mid band, so we'll solo them both. There we go. I'm just trying to dial that release in so it doesn't sound like a G, so that when we get back into everything being in the mix, it doesn't sound obvious.
So you guys are complaining about, why'd you make it so complicated? Why'd you put a hold control in there? This is why there's a hold control. Not just that, but these EDM guys do this crazy stuff with the sidechain and the hold control on this gate that may be a crime against humanity, but it works for them. So hold control is a good thing.
Because that's something for me that being able to control the high band and make it really tight is really useful for me. And now let's solo the low end and try and get the low end to be quite tight as well.
And this is where the attack's really going to matter, because when this guy opens up, there's a very good chance it's going to ride the actual waveform. I mean, the actual sine wave, the frequency of the bass, and end up clicking open like a really nasty, harsh, artifacty click of doom. Oh, your mail explodes. Uh-oh. Are you dead? Uh-oh.
There we go. So let's listen to that without the gate at all. And with. And now let's try that in the mix without. And with. so much cleaner and so much less.
And again, that's before you throw in a compressor and an exciter and whatever else. I mean, if you're going to boost the high end or anything, that's the way to do it without turning it into an auxiliary cymbal mic.
Of that kind of worry of spill, that now on those busy parts where the hi-hat's smacking away, that's not going to be in there at all. Now, I did say I'd talk about the side chain. So the side chain, if I look at that, which all the knob controls are on the left, if I do that, suddenly nothing's going to be gated because firstly, we've not defined a side chain in Reaper. But
yeah, so this is where it's going to hurt if you're using another DAW. This may not be that easy to do. Most of them can handle this now. They don't handle it very well, I don't think, but you do need a way to send a sidechain signal into this track, and not all DAWs really let you set it up this way. Inside Reaper, every channel has 128 internal track channels, and you can treat that as its own 128 channel mixer, and any channel can send into any one of those channels or receive from any one of those channels. So this gets a little bit trickier in other DAWs, but I've seen this work in Cubase Studio One, definitely works in Pro Tools. But the multi-out side of this is going to get weird because as far as I know, there's really no way to do it in Cubase. Not sure about Logic. Cubase has multi-out for VST instruments, but not for VST. And these the guys that came up with the VST spec. I don't understand why it doesn't work in their own product. But if you guys can actually pull this in Cubase, let me know. I've asked on several forums. I've done some live videos to try and get this done with some Cubase experts, and it doesn't seem to work. But let me know. Logic, I'd like to know. Studio One, I think, can do it. I think Pro Tools can do it. But this may be trickier to get the sidechain going for your particular DAW.
secondly, there's nothing being sent to the sidechain. In this case, it's not something I would need, but we could do the kind of classic, you know, kick drum and bass kind of one side chaining.
Okay, so this part right here, I think he's thinking of a compressor. The kick drum and bass thing it's going to go backwards for him for what he thinks. He goes through this, and I think he's thinking of the compressor, like where the kick drum turns the bass guitar down with the compressor. This does the opposite thing, and this is what these EDM guys are using this for. It's like a bonker. They have a guitar sample playing, like a really distorted one, you know, and they set up the sidechain coming from the kick going into this gate, and just the middle, like the lows and highs are always going, and then the middle gets punched up every time the sidechain sends a signal to open this guy up. So this is just one use of it. I mean, you could do this with a single band. You could bypass the other bands. You could drag the bands out so that only you have a single band noise gate and you got a sidechain coming in. But chances are, if you're doing that, you already have a gate that came free with your DAW that does. Well, actually, I can't even say that because some of these DAWs gates are still stuck in the 1980s or something. But in general, I think Logic's will do this, and I think definitely Regate will. So anyway, so he's thinking of a compressor, I think, and what you're really going to see here is a bonker. This is using, I don't know if they did this in the old Run DMC albums or old Beastie Boys albums, but it definitely has that effect where when the snare hits, it's popping a guitar track open.
And the other, we could do that, but only use the low end as a band and leave the other bands with the floor at maximum so they don't get affected. So let's try that just for fun. Let's put the multi-band gate.
So I think this is a fumble, but it's okay because he's going to show you exactly what it does.
Immediately
anyway.
Just click sidechain. So what I'm going to have to do firstly is go into the plugin pin connector at the top and add some channels, track channels 4. And now the sidechain left and right is being fed. What I need to do now is go back to my kick. And I'm going to send the kick in microphone using Reaper sends to all the way down at the bass and change that to be going out to 3 and 4, which is the sidechain inputs.
So that's one way of doing it. I don't want this. This is not really supposed to be a Reaper course here, but if you wanted to do it, there's other ways. So like let's say I wanted the snare to control this track down here. I'm just going to click on the routing and drag. You see a TRS plug, or it's actually supposed to be a TT, but you see it's a tip ring sleeve. Drag from one router to the other. When you drop it in there, look at that. Audio 1, 2 goes to audio 1 and 2. And you can click this and choose new channels on receiving track. So even though you didn't have 4-track channels before, now you do. That'll automatically put the pins up for multiband gate sidechain as well. And then make sure that you got this set the way you want. You want it post fader, post pan, pre fader, post effects, or pre fader, pre effects. And depends what you want to do. But if you remember, if you mute that channel, you may stop sending if it's post fader. So your regular routing caveats on there.
So now let's just solo the bass.
It's pretty industrial, right? Now that is a bonker.
Right, so what I want to do is completely bypass the low and high bands. I don't want those at all, and I'm going to solo the low band.
So if you did it this way, it's going to add energy to the bass every time the kick hits, which might be exactly what you want. But in general, usually with these modern mixes where you're trying to get everything as loud as possible, it's the other way around. Also, if you got a crappy bass player, you can use the compression and kick drum trick to make it sound more like the kick drum is playing the bass guitar, kind of ducking all the stuff out of it that's in the wrong place. But it only can work so far depending on how crappy that bass player is.
So now with the...
You almost put this in the toms too. That might be cool. So that's the overall phase polarity switch that he's looking at. Oh yeah, I don't know if he's going to talk about this, but there is you can do MS encoding and decoding with this plugin, or you could choose the detector only listens to the mid or only listens to the sides. There's some other modes in there. One based on one of Glenn Fricker's videos, I think.
Couple of cool features that I've not covered yet in the settings that are kind of tucked away is that there's mid-side encoding options. So if you've got something that's been recorded mid-side, you can then encode it on the way in and the way out. So you can sort that out. And so you can send mid-side out if you want, or you can bring mid-side in, or both. And then the detector's stereo encoding, you can choose whether to use one side of the input or the mid-side, or just however you want to do it. It's all tucked away in there. There's, of course, on the left and right, input and output levels. I would generally leave them where they are, but if you need to manipulate them, they are there for you. One thing I didn't really talk about before that I want to dive into is an extra feature that this plugin has that makes it a really, really powerful extra tool, because each of these bands can be sent out to its own track.
Okay, so again, when did we release Reaper? Like 2006, I think. I thought that this is another decade now, and then some. I thought by now every DAW would have sensible routing. Like we described it back in the Reaper days that we're bringing in our regular patch bay screwdriver and soldering iron so that you can put a connector anywhere you want. Inputs, outputs, you make your splits, mults, whatever. But like I said, even though Steinberg made the VST spec, I don't think there's a way to do multi outputs of non-instrument VSTs in Cubase or Nuendo, and I don't think you can do it in Logic either. Even in audio units, I don't think you can. You can in Reaper with these things, but it's sad. You may not be able to use this feature, but basically this is the three-way crossover where you're splitting the actual low, mid, and high bands out. They come out their own channels, and the stereo pair can still be used at the same time, the regular in and out. And this can be a really, really handy feature, and not just for this plugin, but like for crossover plugins where you're splitting a bass guitar, and you can send it out to different tracks for distorting the highs and compressing the lows, whatever. It's sad. I wish the other DAWs would catch up, but you know, it's been 15 years or whatever it's been, 17 years, so maybe it'll never happen.
Which means that you can do loads of like parallel processing without having to buy even more plugins. So as an example, I've got a bass here. And that's nicely gated. It's in 3 separate bands. But in the output here, I've changed the track channels to 8 track channels. And now the output, as you can see here, goes output left and right. Then we've got low, mid, and high all going out separately. All we have to do now is route those to somewhere. So I'm going to go to my bass channel here, this grey one, open up the router.
Sorry about this AC noise, but it's
untick master send channels. Make sure it has 8 track channels. And so I've already had send to these new tracks that I've made. Bass low. So I'm going to define stereo source 3 and 4 because that's the low. 5 and 6 is the mid. 7, 8 is the high.
Right, so you see how that's laid out, right? Let me pull up multiband gate. So if I had more track channels, see 1 and 2 are the regular input. I mean, this is by default. You can, of course, in Reaper, you can change this however you want. The regular input is 1 and 2. The sidechain input's on 3 and 4. The main output, that's going to have the combined signal of all 3 bands, comes out on pins 1 and 2 out. Low is 3 and 4, mid is 5 and 6, and high is 7 and 8.
So I'm going to repeat this a couple of times by adding a couple of new sends. One to bass mid, which I'm going to go stereo source 5 and 6, and bass high, which is 7 and 8. And we should hear all of these now if we press play. But why this is important is, say, the mids, that has its own channel now. So I can do something like I can bring a distortion plugin in of my choosing, bring in the one that's just JS distortion.
That is ultimate brutality right there.
There we go. So that's just on the mids and not on the bass and treble. So let's bring the bass and treble in. Suddenly we've got a big, angry, djenty kind of bass. But the lows are unaffected because they're completely clean. I could limit the lows like you would in a mix. Have the highs completely natural. EQ that distortion a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit heavy. Let's put the Reaper stock EQ on there. So bring that in a bit. And of course, if we can hear some rattle on that mid now, we can go back to our gate and tighten it. And now that's a big, angry, distorted mid-range. Do something entirely different with the high range. Do something entirely different with the low range. let's just look at the low range. And let's bring in the Reaper compressor, good old recomp. Where are you? Too many compressors on it. Make it completely infinite. There we go. Bring that back up by a few dB. So now the low end's got a limiter, the mid range has got a distortion, the high end is just natural. And that is one solid bass tone that was made possible by the splitting of the multiband gate. And I think that just about covers everything because there's a lot to go at. But once you've used it, it's really, really powerful. Now, part 2 of the video, you've just seen me do that on the snare. Now I need to do it on the kick because let's get another multi-band gate on there. I've been using other gates on some of these instruments and not been very happy. Like, here's how the kick was with the previous gate, which was the drum gate from Slate, which is all right, but this is the kick. Oh, no. This is the kick without the gate. Quite a lot of ring, quite a lot of bleed. And here's it with the Slate gate. Oh, there's also a sample running. I'll just kill the sample. So here's it without.
Still a snare in there.
And here's it with.
Oh, okay, never mind. That was with the outside.
I just was not impressed with that. It sounded flat and lifeless, so that's now getting deleted. And now in comes the multi-band gate. So first thing I'm going to do, like I said, was key listen. And listen not just for the note of the kick, but for the real defined slap.
Remember, like I was saying, that there may not be enough transient information that happens quickly with the low end, the original harmonic, and glad he caught it there. So he's saying the slap. If you got more slap than anything else in that track, it's going to be super easy. But chances are, you're recording bands that don't really have that much control, and it might just be poofy, and it can be tricky. So you may have to go higher than you'd like in the key listen frequency wise. And again, sorry, let me say this one more time. This is what I call about the perverse inverse. That the bands who are most capable of paying for studio time are usually the bands that are in least need of studio time for the basic things. The really good bands already know how to play their drums well. And so they can actually record them pretty quickly, surprisingly quickly sometimes. Whereas the amateur band really needs a lot of time and a lot of work on the mix because they're never going to track it all that well. But they also have the least amount of money to pay for studio time. So that is the perverse inverse. And listening to this drummer, this guy is so good. Yeah, you can almost get away with no gate anyway.
There we go. I'm not necessarily listening for that boom thing, because if I try and narrow that down as the key gate listen, then that big boom is going to keep the gate open way longer than I want it to be open. I'm trying to look for that definite knock as the key, and then I can set my threshold accordingly. So too low, and then. Now, one thing I do want to do is go to, there was a section where Mike didn't hit the kick as hard, very much on purpose. There we go. That's it. So it's triggering there properly as well as in other places. So I'm now gonna.
So it sounds like the snare may be triggering the gate. Again, we're always working on this algorithm, so we want to have as much discrimination as possible. I'm sure somebody's going to click that out of this video and use it against me. Look, he's in favor of discrimination. Yes, I am in favor of discrimination between. Oh yes, clip that part out too. Thank you. But between the wanted sound and the unwanted sound. That's the point of your noise gates detector. So
just loop a little section and focus on the mids first, because I like to do mids first all the time. This probably won't have a floor underneath it. This will be much cleaner than the snare. Right, so firstly let's set the bands so that we've got the knock in the middle.
isn't it horrible to listen to like isolated parts of a drum? Like it just sounds so bad, but in context, you know, it's this giant thing.
There we go. So I'm using less hold on this because I don't want to but I'm using quite a long release, so I get a bah. So I'm tailoring the kind of the mid response of the kick.
And this is a case where you probably want to have a chunk of look ahead on here. I mean, no joke, you might want 20 milliseconds of look ahead on here. And that's again, sorry, hoping that your DAW actually handles latency compensation properly. Otherwise, all bets are off.
To be really quite clean. And now I can tailor the high response to be probably shorter.
That snare's still getting in there. That's bugging the hell out of me. I'm hoping there's a way to get that out of there. Gotta raise the threshold a tiny bit. You can automate the threshold. There's no reason you can't do that. So like, which one do we have that on the snare track? Okay, so if I go to trim and I go to multi-band gate, threshold. And so here's your threshold line. Let's say that the kick drum is really quiet over here. Get that time selection in there, click the envelope, and in my case, hit Shift E, and I could lower or raise the threshold, puts 4 envelope points down there. Again, this is a Reaper thing, sorry, but I'm sure your DAW has something similar. So if I hit Find Shortcut, Shift E, envelope, insert 4 envelope points at time selection. So that's what that does. So it's like, oh yeah, that part, man, he's really hitting it here, and it's letting the snare in too much. Raise the threshold right there, no problem.
Right, let's go back to that key, because I can hear the snares triggering the key. Let's see if that plus the transient shaper can really bring it together. So
I pull that sustain all the way down, and put the attack all the way up, and you're okay.
So I've brought some low end back in. And the transient shaper there is really cleaning things up. Because now the snare hits are not coming through at the same level as the kick hits. Let's just turn off the low for a minute.
That snare's still getting in there.
See, that's nice and clean now. And now the low end needs dealing with.
There you go.
So the low end's got a little bit of a clicky in there, so I'm going to bring in some look ahead to try and soften that.
You can raise the attack too. You can put a lot of look ahead in there, I promise. Way more than you would think. You can test this with regate if you don't have multiband gate, and you'll see the same thing. You know, it happens to be some overlap in the designer's brain between regate and multiband gate, if you didn't know. So it does very similar things on a single band anyway.
Right, so I'm not getting the clicky on the low end anymore, which is great, but the low end is rumbling on a bit too long. So,
and again, this is a good use of that transient shaper, because you can make the sustain so short that you're just basically triggering the open.
So now I've got a longer hold and a shorter release, so that is going bar, bar. But on the low end, I kind of want that because I want to be able to choose and define how long the low end rings for. Let's try them in context. And here's without the gate. And now in the mix without. And with. Yeah, that really feels like I now have more leverage to EQ that. So I'm going to bring in an EQ. And because there are certain frequencies in there that I don't really want. There we go. But I would never have been particularly confident with doing this before the gate was good. Now let's turn back on our extra stuff, the reverbs and the samples and all that kind of stuff, and see how much better that sounds. And now for the real test, everybody. Now for the toms. As you can see, I had to manually gate the toms because they were an absolute nightmare. And even
you may
then,
still manually gate the toms.
they were a nightmare because some of these sections, like this is with 3 gates from Boz Labs, which again are okay.
So you notice that even though he's cut the things out by hand, and interesting, he's doing it with mute instead of delete the way I do it. Interesting. Even though he's done it by hand, he still has the gate in there. And it may be that you're still going to cut it by hand, even with multiband gate. As if you got a real good drummer, you won't. But you might. And even then, multiband gate will help immensely for that, because you can control how much high is in that signal. Even the cut up thing, again, it's no different than a single band gain. When you cut up this stuff, you either make a choice to let cymbals in, or you make the drum too short. So you're still facing the same dilemma.
And you can hear that even with those gates on, it's really causing issues whenever the drums are hit. So what I'm going to do is start with what was probably the worst tom. I've just deleted all those things. And I'm going to leave the manual gating in, but this is a really good section to use as an example. So I'm going to just select that and loop it. because Mike's really kind of, this is a gentle section of the song. There are other parts. He's an
that's where it
incredibly
gets tricky,
consistent
or
drummer
ghost notes
when
and
it comes to the massive metal sections. But this is kind of a much lighter section, and using gates on really light sections in the past has been difficult, shall
Again,
we
as
say.
much as a pain as it is,
again,
you could use automation to change the threshold if you need to.
same process. Start with the key listen. Now, this one I'm really trying to nail down because there is another tom that's going dum 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 dum. So I'm trying to isolate that one. So I'm going to bring the sustain down.
No, sorry for all this noise. I'm opening a package.
Bring up the attack. Now, hopefully, that's doing exactly what we need there. We're about to find out by taking the key listen off and bringing the threshold up.
And again, you may want to take that sustain
And then
all the way down.
doing
In
each
fact,
band
I'm
separately.
almost sure you
So
do.
let's start with the mids. And the solo for the high.
Yeah, really pull that sustain down. Turn the attack up all the way.
Let's find some toms with more of a hit. We've not tuned our bands. So let's look at our, that's a good one. So
you see how, look at the shape here. This is what makes this thing so tricky. And this is part of what we're working on all the time. I want to see a big spike, and I don't want to see any of this. And it's tricky to do. And it might start being that we need to put an EQ, an actual EQ inside that side chain. I think that could help a lot.
make the mids have a much more forgiving kind of release. There we go, much more aggressive. And on the lows, we're gonna need more look.
And so a lot of people just leave the toms lows bypassed right here. If it's low enough, it's actually, I know it's bleed or whatever, but it's not really that bad. It can pull the snare off center a little bit, can pull the kick off center a little bit, but depending on how your toms are set, it might not be that bad because there's a lot of energy down there. And that was the point of this gate in the first place, is I wanted the toms to be able to ring on and still be able to get that slap on the high end.
Look ahead. And
there we go. I mean, that's how I said it.
There we go. Let's see how that comes together.
Oh, got one little blip in there.
So with the multi-band, I put the multi-band gate at the start. It must have moved it by accident. That's my fault.
Oh,
Let's bring the
Okay,
threshold
much
down.
better. It's not anywhere near as compressed.
There we go. Right, so
Yeah, tip tap kind of toms, they're really hard to gate, and you made, this is
that's a
exactly
really
the kind of
clean
case
gate,
where I'm
probably
saying to
because
put
of
the
that transient designer.
EQ
This
there.
is without.
Or not the EQ. Let's put a MIDI note trigger in this opening.
And this is width. Now I'm going to have to do this for each one of these drums. I'm going to copy this across now, and it's probably going to be wrong in terms of the levels and in terms of the frequencies. For a start, the key listen will be wrong. There we go. I can really see it now. Now let's try it.
See, nothing's perfect. We try our hardest, but there's always room for improvement here. Yeah, we're getting there. Really hard to discriminate between the wanted and unwanted signal here.
Yeah, so I'm bringing nearly 10 dB of attack up on that transient shaper there.
Take that sustain down all the way, I'm telling you.
But the concept is sound, so I can copy that across to the rack tom and see how that copes with, again, changing the key. Let's just put in a 0 for the sustain. And then key. Yeah, now this is the tricky stuff because I'm getting dum dunk and I'm getting the snare in there, so we really need to refine the key.
See how much look ahead he's got here? He figured this out too. Take that sustain out.
So the transient shaper doesn't sound nice, but it does. It does pretty much exactly what we need. And I can probably shorten the tom's low end off a little bit. And see how we do copying this to the top one, which I think I had to be very aggressive with the gate on this. So this, you can really hear the there we go. So the gate's catching a lot of that now on the high end, that so here's all 4 toms together.
There's still some bleed. It's way the hell better than it was. It's really hard to get completely.
I think that without the gates was like this. That's night and day. Let's try that in the mix. I'm feeling like I can turn up that low tom now.
Yeah, so look at what he's doing here with this, like 3K. Is that, oh no, sorry. What is that? 3K or is that 8K? And he's turning it up 6 decibels. Yeah, okay, sorry, like 4 or 5 decibels at 8K. Do that with the cymbals hanging out in there, and it's just going to be pain.
just sounds so alive now where it wasn't before. And that bottom tom, now I can extend the release a bit to let it bong. Same with the rack toms. That is night and day difference, this mix to me. If I turn off these gates now and play this whole section again, so all 6 of the gates off, I'll turn the reverb send back on for good measure. It's pretty good, and now it's really good. Like, I can do things like I can allow things to ring. Where before I had to cut these gates really short, so I might end up revisiting some of this. Because where I previously had to cut all my manual gates super short, now that's on me. I can fix them because I had to cut them where these next snare hits were. And now I don't. I can let the low end come out a little bit. I mean, I dare say I could probably unmanual gate these now, but just for safety's sake and because I put the time in, I'm not going to do that. But
you know, see,
yeah,
okay, so that's another thing. Like, people have no idea. Like, why does it take so long for you to mix something? Because it ain't the mix. It's the mix prep. It's the editing. It's all that stuff. Working on toms, it's insanely time consuming. It's yeah, if you don't do it, there's very little appreciation for it. But if you don't do it, everybody's going to complain that the thing sounds crappy. So
SP multi-band gate is really powerful, and that's cleaned up my mix absolutely no end there, which is really impressive because that was something I was kind of, you know, I was expecting it to do good things as I was showing you all the details at the start there, but I really wasn't expecting it to be that clean. So there you go. I hope you got something interesting from this video. I certainly got a lot out of learning about the multi-band drum gate, and that will be used by me on anything that I do any drum production with from here on out, because spill is my enemy, and if I can delete the...
Spill is the enemy. Spill is the enemy. Bleed is not your friend. Embrace the bleed. It's like embrace the pickup truck that's running at you down the road. Go ahead, embrace it.
The spill properly, then I can EQ all the drums how I like them for that big larger than life sound without bringing the kind of the cymbal wash out on the drums. So yeah, big thanks to AIXDSP, try saying that 10 times fast, for supplying me with the drum gate and the other plugins and sponsoring this video. And thanks to everybody on Patreon for helping me to make videos like this. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.
All right. Well, that was awesome. Okay. I have a lot to do today, so I'm out of here. I'll see you guys later.